Asia's richest countries are facing an economic time bomb, and it has nothing to do with oil. Here in Singapore, as well as in Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, the birth rate has plunged to its lowest level on record. And politicians across the continent are wondering who is going to drive the next cycle of economic growth, staff the military and provide for the elderly. I'm Taimur Nabili, and on this edition of 101 East we ask, can Asia's economies survive without more babies? Just a generation ago, the Singapore government was so concerned about a population explosion on this tiny island, it actively discouraged large families. The Stop at 2 policy was partially responsible for a birth rate that plummeted from more than 6 children per family to less than 2 today. Howell Davis now reports on how the Singapore government is frantically scrambling to reverse that trend.
It's a city living at high speed. Since independence just over 40 years ago, Singapore has experienced explosive growth, transforming the lives of its citizens. But that's had some unwelcome consequences. Among them, a huge drop in fertility, falling to a record low in 2007, the 28th successive year it's dropped. For single women like Noelle Tan, it's partially because there's simply no time to meet potential partners.
It's very easy to get carried away with your day-to-day, and if say things like, oh, I'm too busy to date, or I work all the time, or weekends I sleep, or that sort of excuses. So yeah, maybe to answer your question, some women do fall into that, like, where got time? It's very typical Singaporean thing.
But the failure to have children is also due to other fundamental factors. One of which is the vast change in women's expectations and desires over the last 2 decades.
Over the last 20 years, education level has gone up and up. The females are very well involved in education, involved in the society, involved in the economy. So women are more and more educated. They tend to spend more time at work and climb up the corporate ladder, which is why they tend to get married a little bit later.
That's led many Singaporean women to put off having children until their late 20s or 30s, and to settle for having 1 or 2. That's not enough to replace the numbers of Singaporeans dying or emigrating. The Sows have decided to limit their family to their one daughter, Angie. They won't be having any more children, and in fact initially hadn't wanted any at all.
We probably don't see ourselves wanting to bring up a kid. We know, we anticipate it's going to be a very tough process, and we just don't see ourselves wanting to go through that process.
It's a far cry from the late 60s and 70s, when the Singaporean government was worried about overpopulation. It introduced policies aimed at reducing the number of children born, calling for people to stop at 2. Many women opted for sterilisation, and others were put under pressure to do so.
I was always scolded and told off when I went to the clinic. They would say, "Why do you have so many children?" When I went to the doctors, they even told me to have my tubes tied. I didn't want to.
But since the mid-1980s, the government has actively been encouraging young Singaporeans to have children. Classes in sensual dancing are among those set up by the government-run Social Development Unit. It also provides advice to those interested in dating and has matchmaking services available. Lydia Gan runs a dating service that gets government funding. She says the SDU used to have a reputation for attracting those who couldn't find partners elsewhere, but that's changing.
In the past, there's this social stigma against SDU. They call it the single, desperate, ugly club. So, but that stigma has been fading over the years. A survey has shown that singles are more and more proactive in attending social events and matchmaking services.
This Singaporean approach is almost certainly unique, with some calling it social engineering. But the city-state is hardly alone in suffering low fertility. In almost all countries where women have gained access to education, birth rates have fallen sharply. Much of Europe has had low rates for decades. While in East Asia, countries like South Korea, Japan and Taiwan have only slightly higher fertility rates per woman. Hong Kong is even lower, with women on average having just one child, far below the level needed to replace its population. Just a few kilometres from Singapore city centre lies the island of Kusu. Here, childless couples come to ask for divine assistance. But Singapore, along with its wealthy Asian neighbours, needs more reliable methods of boosting its population. That primarily means immigration. Singapore has introduced policies aimed at increasing the country's number of immigrants. Other countries like Japan and South Korea are less used to the idea, but they face dire consequences if they don't lower their barriers to entry.
If you have continuing very low birth rates, you have a downward spiral in population. If the sorts of fertility rates that you have in Japan now were to continue for long enough, and you didn't have migration, the Japanese population would just about disappear in 200 years. There'd be none left.
That's a prospect that has belatedly got governments across the region racing to address their fertility problems. But whether they have the courage to embrace immigration or can persuade their own people to have more children remains an open question.